Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction. Welcome, finally, to the summary and ranking video for my animated 90s series. Things got pretty hectic for me at the end of last year, and with adding a new job to my existing workload, it's been a bit of an adjustment to normalize the schedule. I really appreciate you all being patient with me, and things have settled down enough that I should be back on the content grind. Watch for the last video in my Hanna-Barbera retrospective next week, and the long-promised announcement regarding channel updates. As for this particular video, I'm going to approach it a little differently than I did for the 80s and talk more in broad concepts rather than throw a bunch of graphs on screen, and then I'll rank the years. I also want to do one more video to finish off the 90s with a top 10 most important moments in animation for the decade. I'll probably go back and do a similar list for the 80s too. Enough about how I'm going to do things though, and let's get to actually doing them.
Yeah, it's a bit much.
Okay, so let's start this video out by immediately going against something I said in the intro, and looking at a couple of graphs. I promise these are the only ones I made though, so bear with me. This just happens to be the easiest way to take a look at the volume of releases that we saw throughout the decade. Checking that out, we see that the decade starts with less than 30 new series and ends with more than 50. That's a 93% increase between 1990 and 1999. Trend-wise, that makes the 90s notably different from the 80s, which ended on a sharp decrease. If I put the two decades up together to compare them, we see similar trends right up to that point, including that small late-decade dip in each. I don't have any graphics to demonstrate it, but that increasing trend is pretty indicative of how things continue into the new millennium as well. But the more interesting question is what kind of activity was that trend comprised of? Well, the first notable shift that we saw in the decade was one that affected my dearly beloved action series, with a hard shift toward darker, more mature storytelling. It probably goes without saying to those of you watching this channel, but we've got Batman the Animated Series in 1992 to thank for that. Interestingly enough though, there was another series from that same year that introduced a second shift for action cartoons that became a persistent and permanent fixture of the genre. Specifically, we saw the introduction of ongoing narrative and through stories that continued across an entire series run. Thanks of course to X-Men the Animated Series. Sure, we'd seen elements of that before with things like Zack's search for his wife in Galaxy Rangers, but that was a B-story that only popped up occasionally, whereas X-Men made significant references to the events of previous episodes all throughout the series. In my opinion, both of these were indicative of the influence of anime working its way into the way US animators and writers thought, since the only real examples of that from shows we'd gotten before were found in things like Star Blazers, Robotech, and other imports. It was 1992 where they really took a firm hold on American-produced properties though, and action cartoons were better for it. Thanks to that, we ended up with series like Beast Wars, Roswell Conspiracies, and Exo Squad over the rest of the decade. Moving on, we see another important event in, well, not animation I guess, but more animation-adjacent content that happened the very next year. That event was the American introduction of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which brought even more Japanese style to us with the reintroduction of tokusatsu. Again, we'd seen this in the 80s with shows like Voltron and the giant robot fights of Tranzor Z and Macron 1, but this was the reemergence of giant robots and giant monsters in live action. Shows like this hadn't really been popular with US audiences since the early and mid-70s, when shows like Ultraman and Johnny Sacco grabbed the attention of American kids. Saban really came up with something magical, mixing the suited scenes of the original Japanese series with new footage that placed the action squarely in an American setting. I know that this trend didn't necessarily last a long time, as these types of series faded out after a handful of years, but Power Rangers at least continues to air today, and I think that these series were somewhat responsible for the return of kaiju to American theaters. We started those with a whimper, getting the US Godzilla, but eventually it led to things like Pacific Rim and the King Kong remake, or even the legendary Pictures monsterverse we've got today. I've got two more observations I want to make about the decade before we get into the ranking, so let's move on to talking about slice of life. Specifically, slice of life where the characters weren't living some American fantasy, like the rich kids of Beverly Hills Teens or the rock stars of Gem, but slices of lives real kids lived. The 90s was where we started to get shows like Doug, Arthur, Hey Arnold, and Recess. These were shows that were simply kids doing what kids do, with no magical sidekicks or secret second lives or anything like that. There honestly weren't a lot of stylistically similar series in animation before this point. Japan, however, had been making slice of life consistently since the 1960s, so maybe this was more anime influence. I think it's possible that there may have been more to it though, with things like the end of the Cold War facilitating a shift toward more realism and less escapism, or the rapid proliferation of new technologies throughout the era creating new opportunities that hadn't been available to kids before. Not to mention things like the appearance of newer and more complicated video games creating other mechanisms for wish fulfillment. Could be I'm seeing correlation where none exists though. After all, I'm definitely not a sociologist. It's an interesting situation to think about though in one of the most transformative periods in human history. The final thing I want to mention for the decade due to sheer significance though was the absolute explosion in the influence of adult animation. The Simpsons had opened the door during its first season in the 90s, but it was studios like MTV Animation, with their focus on young adults and willingness to experiment and push boundaries, that really demonstrated the appetite that adult audiences had for animated programming, and material that fell outside of entertainment and even social norms. Liquid Television served as not only a showcase for new creators and new concepts, but also as a testbed for young adults as a primary audience and their willingness to accept new types of media that embrace the bizarre and unusual. The concept was even further refined with MTV's Oddities a couple years later, and Disney and Nickelodeon even tried the same thing for kids through shows like Raw Toonage and Kablam. Disney didn't really follow through though, instead sticking with their usual programming formats, but Nick and Cartoon Network saw some real success with their efforts. The biggest winners here were the networks though, when they realized that the situational comedy of The Simpsons could easily incorporate more of this weirdness and left-field storytelling to broaden its appeal. That, combined with a focus on significantly more observational humor and social commentary, led to the release of shows like South Park, Family Guy, and others in that vein, each proving popular enough to remain on the air even today. These obviously weren't the only significant events of the decade for animation, but I feel that they were the most important. We did see things like anime trying to get a foothold with Sci-Fi Saturday anime and early showings of Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, and Ronin Warriors, but I feel like the real starting point for the anime revolution came with the Toonami version of DBZ in 2000. We also had the huge increase in CGI usage, but I don't really think I want to include that as either a positive or negative in the decade, as it was very much dependent on specific use cases. Then we had the emergence of programming blocks, trying new things and specifically targeting kids in the way Saturday mornings had before, combined with the way primetime was made to get adults in front of their TVs, which was probably easier at this point, as the 90s is when kids started getting TVs in their bedrooms. I could probably make an entire series about the significant events of the 90s, but that's not really what we're here for, so let's get to the ranking. I'd be surprised if many of you didn't see this one coming, but I'm putting 1990 in 10th place since the decade started kind of slowly. That's definitely not to say that we didn't get some great stuff this year, because we absolutely did. 1990 gave us some classics like Captain Planet, Tiny Toons, and Tailspin, as well as some fun shows like Attack of the Killer Tomatoes and Super Mario Bros. 3. It also gave us some false starts though, with series like Swamp Thing and Barnyard Commandos, which lasted for 5 and 4 episodes respectively. Not only that, but it didn't really give us anything new as much as it continued the same sorts of programming we saw in the late 80s. Worst of all from a ranking perspective, especially for a channel that's ostensibly focused on 80s action animation, it gave us a fairly weak reboot of one of the most beloved shows of the previous decade with The New Adventures of He-Man. There just wasn't enough here in 1990 for me to put it any higher on the list. Moving on, I'm choosing 1996 for the next spot here. It would probably rank lowest on the list for me personally, as I didn't watch much animation at all during the year and don't really have any true nostalgia for it. Also, looking down the list of premieres, we don't see much that's especially noteworthy except for Superman the Animated Series, which was really kind of treading the path Batman had already laid out, and Beast Wars, which didn't introduce much that was really new to the Transformers formula. We did get some other fun stuff like Dexter's Lab, Hey Arnold, and Mighty Ducks, but nothing I'd consider to be a benchmark series. Transformers was a great example of the ongoing storyline, and Hey Arnold was one of the best of the grounded slice-of-life series, but neither one's really significant enough to boost the year's placement. 1994 comes next in my ranking, and I'd honestly be completely willing to swap it with 1996, since my analysis of both years is pretty similar. This one was a year of continuing trends, with an influx of tokusatsu in the forms of VR Troopers, Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad, the long-awaited US airing of Ultra 7, and tattooed teenage alien fighters from Beverly Hills. Honestly though, that last one was a huge black mark for showing how low the quality could get, and in my opinion did more to hurt the genre than help. We also got several continuations of the dark and gritty with Phantom 2040, Battletech, and of course one of the frontrunners for Best of the Decade with Gargoyles. That series is why I put this year above 1996 actually, since for my money it's better than anything we got from that previous year. This one also brought a massive surge of superheroes like nothing we'd seen before, with Spider-Man, Iron Man, Fantastic Four, Wildcats, and The Tick, It's lineups like the one here in 1994 that make the rest of this list so difficult. My next spot in the ranking goes to 1993, since it's the year that brought one of those significant events I talked about a few minutes ago. That specific event was the appearance of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the first series of the decade to be a bona fide cultural milestone here in the West. It had obviously already been one in Japan, with Super Sentai having been continuously on the air over there since 1974, but it was a gateway series here and has had some massive staying power. That wasn't the only contribution from the year, though, since we got the first full series output from Liquid Television with the standalone premiere of Beavis and Butthead, which for better or worse was something of a cultural milestone itself. Then on top of all that, we also got what I consider to be some of the best animated action of the decade, with Biker Mice from Mars, SWAT Cats, Exo Squad, Sonic Sat AM, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, and Mighty Max. The fact that we got the absolute best kid-friendly animated comedy of the decade with Animaniacs made this a great year too, but you'll see as we go why I chose not to put it any higher. You might not agree, but you'll see. Closing out the bottom half of the ranking is 1991, and I'll take this opportunity to remind everyone that this ranking is based on objective criteria, but because of how close the competition is, it's also heavily influenced by my subjective opinions. If you disagree with my ranking, that's cool, because I'm on the fence about several placements and could easily be convinced that they should be rearranged. It seems as though every year so far has at least one show that's a best of the decade contender. That's true for 1991 as well, since it gave us Darkwing Duck and the Pirates of Darkwater, just to name a couple. But I put it this high on the list because it's really where Nicktoons got its start. Like I said earlier, to me that's the equivalent of primetime programming for kids, which is a pretty significant event in my mind. Especially with the writing being on the wall for Saturday mornings, we were in danger of not really having a time for kids to vegetate over a block of consistent programming. The Disney afternoon was going strong, but after school hours were at the leading edge of fizzling out as well. Nicktoons hit at the best possible time, or, I don't know, maybe it was partly responsible for the failures of Saturday morning and after school. Regardless of which side of that argument you think likely, their appearance was an important thing nonetheless. Opening the top 5 for this list is 1995, which for me was the year my cartoon watching started to really taper off. Oddly though, looking at cartoons over the 80s and 90s like I have through these series, I see that their evolution follows the same trajectory as my own and others of my age. I was starting my senior year of high school in 1995, on the cusp of adulthood as it were, and cartoons were as well, which is why the year takes this spot on my list. 95 brought with it some excellent shows that straddled the line between teen and adult, with Eon Flux and The Max, which also solidified MTV's animation strategy for the decade, and the Sci-Fi Channel really started to bring the dark and mature with Saturday Anime. These were all shows that those of us who were 15, 16, or 17 could get away with watching without too much trouble from the parents, but which definitely weren't for kids. In a lot of ways, they seemed like acknowledgments from creators and showrunners that us 80s kids weren't going to give up on the cartoons we loved, but that we needed them to be more than what entertained us on Saturday mornings. Of course, the fact that we got plenty of series in that vein this year as well, like Freakazoid, Street Fighter, and Earthworm Jim, doesn't hurt for earning this year this spot. My next choice for this list may get some pushback, especially being down here at number 4, considering how many series it gave us that are still going strong today, but my choice for this spot is 1999. Don't get me wrong, I can't argue the quality of the shows we got here, but that's the only reason the year ranks this high. The shows were great, but they were continuations of milestones established earlier in the decade. Futurama and Family Guy are stone-cold classics, but they were carrying the torch of the animated sitcoms that came before. Batman Beyond continued the awesomeness of the DC animated universe, Digimon and Monster Rancher followed in the footsteps of a giant we haven't talked about yet, and SpongeBob was built on the foundation that the Nicktoons and Cartoon series had already laid. So yeah, not a lot to talk about with this year justifying its importance, but it's potentially one that's a contender for the top spot based on content alone. Now we get into the top 3 though, and my pick for the bronze is 1998. Why did I put 98 in this slot? Well, one word pretty much sums up my thinking here. Pokemon. I know I used the term cultural milestone with some previous entries, but as true as that may have been for those series I used it with, none of them can get remotely close to Pokemon. If anyone doubts the validity of that statement, take a look at this. Yes, it's from Wikipedia, but I did verify the information, and yeah, it's true. Pokemon as a franchise is nearly twice as valuable as freaking Star Wars. I'll grant that a lot of that is Japan-centric, but the US has certainly contributed its share, and this was the year that the little pocket monsters jumped from our Game Boys to our TVs. Lucky for 98 that it did too, since there were only really a couple shows this year to get excited about, like Powerpuff Girls and the Wild Thornberrys. We did get some great adaptations, like Godzilla and Hercules the series, but bad with the good though, we also got some shows that really knocked some beloved properties down a peg, like Voltron the Third Dimension, Pinky, Elmira and the Brain, and RoboCop Alpha Commando. But even those smudges couldn't take the shine off the year overall. These top 2 years of the decade are only separated by a hair's width to me, so it could have come down to a coin flip. What it actually came down to, though, was where my true love lies with animation, so I'm giving the silver to 1997. I'll grant that The Simpsons opened the door for primetime adult animation, but this was the year that kicked it off the hinges and brought the drinks and music. South Park, King of the Hill, Daria, and Spawn all hit this year. That's the second longest lasting show of all time, the magnum opus of one of the most beloved animation creators of the 90s in Mike Judge, as well as a spin-off from his Launchpad series, and one of, if not the greatest adaptation of a comic book ever put on screen. South Park is arguably even one of the most important animated series of all times in terms of its contributions to the medium and shattering societal limitations typically applied to cable-based animated programming. Love it or hate it, it's impossible to dismiss the impact that it had on the animation landscape. But hey, kids didn't have much to complain about this year either, with the return of Batman and the new Batman Adventures, Recess, The Adventures of Calamity Jane, and a bunch of Nicktoons and cartoons. Overall, it was just an amazing year for cartoons for everyone. However, it wasn't the best year for fans of animated action. That title goes to my choice for the gold medalist, 1992. Sure, this one didn't have the most new shows of the decade. It didn't give us a series that lasted 15,000 episodes or generate the income of several small countries. All this year did was forever change the landscape of animated storytelling and validate cartoons as true art instead of just children's entertainment. In my opinion, we can thank the artwork of Batman and the storytelling of X-Men for that. And yes, the storytelling of Batman was nothing to scoff at either, but I'll hold X-Men up a little higher in that regard for the persistent storyline. Regardless, this pair of shows is where 90s animation was truly born, and where it became substantially different enough from anything that had come before to truly consider it a new generation. Not to mention that the subject matter covered in each of these shows fits so well for us newly minted teenagers at the time, covering important social and political issues in ways that we actually paid attention to. They were hallmarks of quality in animation and set new standards going forward, so that's why I put this one in the gold medal position. And there you have it, my summary and personal ranking of the 1990s in animation. As I said in the intro, I think I'll make one last video for each decade covering the most important events from each, but I'll also go ahead and throw together a couple of top 10 lists that run down my personal favorite shows from each decade as well. Before that though, make sure to look for part 3 of Hanna-Barbera here in the coming week. Also, since I've been gone for a month and a half or so, here's my obligatory plug for you all to check out my book and some of my 80s designs, and also to come over to Discord and join in on the animation chat. Thanks again for being so understanding about the schedule. It's good to be back. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.